Hi everyone and welcome to this real-time tutorial on how to add a grassy background to your portrait. This is something I've had to do in many pet portraits where the photo reference isn't that great, but I've also done it in people portraits and wildlife paintings too, so it's a very useful trick to be able to take the photo reference that you're given and create something much more aesthetically pleasing from it. So enjoy the tutorial, and I'd love it if you would subscribe and help me share the word a little about my channel. That's going to help me release a lot more in the coming months. Now you can see from the photo reference that Jack was sitting on some rather unattractive looking concrete, and I didn't really think that that would make for a very attractive painting, so I suggested to the client about adding a nice grassy background to this, as I thought the greens would really set Jack's white coat off nicely. I've painted a lot of grassy backgrounds, so for this I didn't even go looking for any photo reference of grass. I just kind of know now the collection of greens and different colours that I can add in there to make it seem realistic. The useful thing about Jack's portrait was that he's cast a lovely definite shadow on the ground, and I wanted to make sure that I got that effect on the grass. So the first thing I do is block in a little bit of background colour, and I'm going for quite a light coloured green here, as I want the top of the picture to be much lighter than the bottom. I really want the grass to seem like it's disappearing off into the distance, and I'll add more detail to the grass where it's around the dog and around his paws. But you can afford to be quite loose and a bit more painterly with a background like this, so I'm never aiming to paint every single blade of grass. I have had paintings where I've done very detailed grass foregrounds and backgrounds, and I have literally painted every single blade and every leaf, and sometimes that effect is just what the painting requires, but in this case, and with many of the pet portraits where the focus is really on the main subject, what I want to create is an attractive backdrop to really set the main subject off. So not too much detail, just a painterly way to build up the layers of grass so that the overall effect works nicely. And I'm taking quite a blue-green here, so if you're painting in the shadows, there's so many different types of green. And as a general rule, when I'm painting in the shadows in green, either foliage or grass, I'm using greens that have a bit more blue in them, so I'm thinking of shadow tones. And perhaps where sunlight is hitting green foliage or grass, I'm thinking about greens that have more yellow in them, a bit more warmth. So just by your colour choices, your chosen values, you can create that effect very easily of light and shadow. But it's so important to choose the right colours in the first place. So as always, I'm giving the pastel a good rub into this paper. I'm using velour pastel paper, something I use quite a lot, although I do like other pastel papers such as Pastel Matte, Canson Tint I also have used. And I have a lot of videos coming soon with some examples of work on different papers and how they react a little differently to the velour. But as a general rule, everything I'm showing you on the velour paper can be applied in some way on these other surfaces as well. I'm often talking about my colour choices and the mark making, all of which works across the board with pastel. And you can see here that I'm just using short marks, vertical marks, dotting it in, and I'm not being very fussy at this stage. As always with my lower layers, they're quite messy. I'm just thinking about the texture of the grass and how the grass in the foreground is going to have bigger, longer marks than that grass that recedes into the distance. So if you want to give the effect of distance, you really need to think about how much detail you add to the foreground and also the size of your marks. So it stands to reason that the grass, as it disappears off into the distance, would have smaller, more dot-like marks. And at this stage, it's just about building up that texture. I'm concentrating on the shadow area here first, mainly because it's going to be the darkest area of the grass. And I just continue for a while building up that initial texture that I'm going to lay down all my next layers on top of. It takes a little patience working on backgrounds. I often see this when I'm teaching workshops. People who really love painting animals have a habit of ignoring the other areas a little and perhaps trying to rush through the background so that they can get to the parts that they really love painting. And I think what I've had to do with myself, because I also felt that way a few years back, I've really had to try and find the love of painting backgrounds, and I think it's just about training yourself to spend as long in those other areas as you would on the beautiful eyes of a dog or the area that you really enjoy painting. It's trying to talk yourself into spending just as long on all of those other areas of the painting too. And trusting as well that in the early stages, backgrounds especially, they tend to look horrible. They look really rough and unfinished. I often don't like the background that I'm painting until I've got the face of the main subject in and I can start to see it come to life. So a lot of the time it's about trusting that the effect will work later on when you get the main subject in, and trusting that you don't need to put quite as much detail in there for the effect to work. It's much more often to do with the colour values that you choose, and you can be much looser with your mark making if you get those colour values right. So I've almost got this whole area blocked in with my first layer, and I'll give that a good rub into the paper before applying the next layers on top. And you can see that my shadow has sort of disappeared into the rest of the grass, but once I add some of the highlighted grass around the edges of that shadow, it will pop back out again. Now at the very top of the image, I said I wanted less detail up here, and I'm really going to avoid adding any small marks towards the top of the piece. So I'm using pastel on its side, blending it in. I also wanted to get a bit lighter towards the top, as things tend to get lighter in value as they recede into the distance. So I'm using some nice light green tints and using the side of the pastel just to make that all nice and smooth at the top. And you've always got that area in the middle where you're trying to transition from the distant background to your more detailed foreground. So you're trying to taper your marks as they come forward in the composition, making them bigger as you come towards the bottom. And just thinking about smaller marks as it disappears into the distance. And I continue in that midground area, just trying to tie the background to the foreground, add some lighter marks of texture over the top of those darker greens that I first laid down. And this background took me about 2 hours, 2.5 hours to create. So there are times when I'm just sitting considering what to do next, and I've edited out all of those extra spaces in my footage, so you don't see that, you just get my painting time. But although this looks like it only took an hour, I would say I took maybe about 2.5 hours. So it's quite a while, just repetitively making these small marks and blending into the lower layers. And now I start to bring some of those lighter tones down towards the front of the painting. And you can see already when I avoid putting any of that light green inside the shadow area, it's instantly making that area stand out. So I want to add different colours into that shadow area later on, saving all my nice zingy greens for out here in the sunshine. But in this case, I really haven't chosen to go a very vibrant green. I'm using quite a lot of this, it's quite a minty green with a bit more blue in it. And I find this creates a bit more of a subtle background rather than a really in-your-face bright green background. It makes me think of that lovely early morning light when you get the sparkly dew on the grass and a little bit of mist in the air. So it creates a lovely soft tonal background to set the subject off. As I come up the layers, the marks get a little smaller, also as it recedes into the background. And you can see here that when I make a collection of little marks, they tend to go in quite a horizontal line. And often when you look at grass, you'll see this pattern as it recedes into the distance. So although the marks you're making are vertical, you're trying to think of little patches of horizontal areas. And if you look at grass, especially short grass like this that's had the lawnmower on it, you definitely see a lot of this pattern. And you can see as I get higher up the picture into the distance, I'm almost not making the vertical mark at all, just using little wavery horizontal lines. So they're not straight lines, but I'm adding a little bit of a shake to my hand as I do that. So I'm back working in some of that shadow area, and this is the first time that I don't pick up a green pastel. Here I'm using a very deep purple, and I think because I can see so many lilac tones in the coat of the dog, it's a good idea to bring some of that same family of colour down into the shadow of the dog too. And you always want to look for extra colours in there to give it more depth and more of a 3D feel. So when you're painting grass, you're never just using all green. Try and see other colours in there. You'll get some brown earths where little bits of grass have died, and you're always going to get different colours in the shadow areas. So I go around those very darkest areas right in underneath the dog. And you can see already that gives the effect of the presence of that animal sitting on the grass. And later on with the grass in the foreground, you obviously want to bring some of those blades of grass up in front of the paws. But for now, I'm just getting in some of that dark shadow area. So I use a mixture of those dark greens and that deep purple to create the shadow. And later on I will come and add more colour in here, as I will throughout the rest of the grass. But you can already see that this begins to give that impression of the shadow. And earlier on I spoke about the difference between that foreground area and the background where it's much lighter and less detailed. So in the foreground I want to bring some of that darker green, just show the real contrast in between the blades of grass. Now I bring in a little bit of my lighter green into the shadow, but really keeping it to a minimum, letting those dark colours underneath shine through. But you will get a little bit of light reflecting off the blades of grass, and I just want to pick out a little more detail in the shadow area. I'm back on the lighter greens, the green with a touch more yellow in it, and just continuing to add some of that subtle detail in the background, blending those marks in, softening the whole effect. And I also find that I blend much more as it recedes into the distance, so blurring those marks together and leaving the marks a little more individual and defined in the foreground. And it really is just a matter of patience and taking your time and building up each new layer, letting the colours you've already applied shine through. So try not to be too heavy-handed, making small, very deliberate marks. And each time I work around the outside of the shadow area, bringing up the value of the grass that's in sunlight, you can see how it adds a bit more contrast between the light and the shadow. So you can see the way I'm laying down these marks, trying to be random in where I place them, making each one not completely vertical, so grass just doesn't grow like that. It's a bit more random. But I wanted to create a very short lawn for this piece, so it's quite different to how you might approach a grassy field where the blades of grass are much longer. But for this effect where the grass is nice and short, I can just focus on making lots of these nice short marks and building up lots and lots of layers to create that depth. By bringing up the value gradually on the grass, I can create a lot of depth, but also control that nice contrast between the light and the shade. But before you go too light, and this applies to most subject matters, whether it's the background or the main subject, you don't want to add any of your light tones too early, as you don't have that depth there to shine through in your lower layers. And as I get towards the top layers, I can be a little more random with my marks, just to make it seem a little more natural. Now at this point I have a good sense of the texture built up, and I want to start thinking about some other colours that I can add into the grass just to make it seem a little less flat. And I often pick up little bits of coral orange, something with a bit of warmth in it to go against the coolness of the greens. And as I've said before, you always want to try and see other colours in there, especially if you can find a use for the opposite colour. So a lot of this grass is a green with quite a lot of blue in it. So I find the coral orange colours make a lovely contrast in amongst that. There are times though that I'll dot little bits of brown, even red, purple, lots of different colours throughout grass. So that's pretty much the grass up to the stage where I would feel happy starting to work on the dog itself. And once I have the dog in, then I'll come back and show you how I add the finishing touches to the grass and really make it seem like Jack the Westie is really sitting there. So Jack the Westie has appeared, and as I work each leg and his paw, I then work that little area around the paw, strengthening the shadow underneath there, and then coming in with some little strokes of grass which might overlap that paw as it sinks down into the grass. And I don't want to go over the top here, as this is a nice short mown lawn that I'm creating, so it wouldn't be sitting up over his paws too much. But even just a hint of that instantly makes the weight of him sink down into the grass. And I can come back in towards the end with some lighter greens that have a little more yellow in them, a little more warmth. And it really gives the impression of the sunlight hitting this area. I'll even use a little bit of sometimes black, sometimes a very dark green or purple. This is really the darkest area in the painting, right in underneath the dog. So if you want it to appear like the dog's really sitting there, you need to try and create that good contrast between your darkest areas and your brightest areas. Now that I have that last leg in, I can do the same again. Just create some little blades of grass that come up around the paw. And I'm constantly turning the pastels, finding a nice sharp edge. Although often when I'm painting grass, I'm not really looking for a sharp edge. Otherwise you're into the territory of painting absolutely every single blade of grass, which really doesn't interest me that much. I find you can get just as photorealistic an effect from being a little looser and a little more painterly. And again, just coming in with some of those lovely coral oranges, adding little splashes of colour here and there just to break up the flatness of the grass. So I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that you take away some helpful hints from it, and that you'll subscribe to my channel for all my future videos. Also, if you can, consider becoming a patron over on my Patreon channel, where I share all my in-depth tutorials and a lot of extras. And it's the folk who are supporting me there that are making all my videos possible, so big thanks to them. But thanks to you for watching, and I'll see you next time.